Hello, welcome back to the ISO 14001 day training session. To continue the latter part of the session, I will cordially invite Mr. Hashan to continue the session.
Right. Thank you very much, Bashini. I think hope you all can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all have had a good lunch. So let's continue with the session. Before start the session, uh, I like to give you a brief summary of the things you have learned so far. So in ISO 14001 standard, you already know that. The standard is based on PDCA cycle. So when we implement the ISO 14001 standard, first we need to plan, then we need to do, and then we need to check uh, the effectiveness of the activities we have done. And then based on the monitoring, measuring, and evaluation results, we need to act upon the findings and the opportunities for improvement to continually improve the management system. So, in the morning sessions, I hope Prasita had discussed the context, I mean, clause number 4 and clause number 5, and also clause number 7. And compliance obligation part had been covered by Randra. So, going forward, I will address the areas of environmental aspect, which means clause number 6.1.2 to 6.1.5, and also the execution part, which means controls and emergency preparedness in clause number 8, and also clause number 9 and clause number 10. So I have about 3 hours, so we'll deep dive into the areas that I have mentioned. And I think, I hope you all enjoy the session. And please participate this session in a very interactive manner, because now we are going to discuss about the heart of this standard. Because when we are implementing ISO 14001, we have to more focus on identification of environmental aspects and related environmental impacts. And also we need to plan to reduce, to minimize the environmental impact due to our activities. And also we have to prepare for the emergencies in an environmental perspective, and we need to monitor the performance, and also we need to continually improve our management system. So now we are going to start the heart of this standard. Rasita and Runner had set the background perfectly, so we'll continue with the session. Right. In clause number 6, it is dedicated for planning part at PDCA cycle. And if we go to the clause number 6.1, I think Prasita had already covered that part. Actions to address risk and opportunities, right? Actions to address risk and opportunities. So in this particular clause, we try to identify the risk and opportunities, and also we try to address those risk and opportunities by planning actions to minimize the impact of the risk, and also to capitalize the opportunities that we have identified. So in clause number 6.1.2, we call about environmental aspects. So first of all, we need to have an idea about the terminology of environmental aspect. Environmental aspect is an element of an organization's activities or products or services that interacts or can interact with the environment, right? So what does that mean? If I say it simply, environmental aspect is the interaction between our activities and the environment, right? If we do an activity that can interact with the environment, right? That interaction we call as the environmental aspect. So I will explain further with a few examples, right? And also an environmental aspect can cause environmental impacts. What's that mean? If there are environmental aspects from our activities, which means the interactions between the environment, then that particular aspect can have impact on the environment, right? If I uh, take an example, when we operate a generator in a factory, right? When we operate a generator in a factory, stack emission can happen from the generator, right? Certain emissions can happen from the generator. So the environmental aspect is release to the air, right? We release certain gases from the generator to the air, right? That's the aspect. Release to the air is the aspect, right? And after, as a result of releasing certain gases, then we we have an impact on the environment, which is air pollution, right? Which is air pollution. So when we operate a generator, we release certain gases, right? Gas emission is the aspect, and due to that emission, we pollute air, right? We pollute air. So that's the impact. So now I think you should have a better understanding about this terminology. So environmental aspect is the interaction between our activities and the environment. Due to that interaction, we uh, we make an impact to the environment, right? So if I take that example again, if we operate a generator, we release certain gases to the environment. So release to the air is the aspect from our generator operation, and pollution, air pollution is the environmental impact. So if we identify aspects, so there can be one or two or one or more environmental impacts from a particular environmental aspect, right? Then once we identify those environmental aspects, then we have to identify the significant environmental aspects. Significant environmental aspects. When we identify the significant environmental aspects, we should define a criteria to identify those significant environmental aspects. I will explain further uh, when the session is going on. And once we identify the significant environmental aspects, then we need to take actions to minimize the significance from those environmental aspects, right? So you can see the examples for environmental aspects: emission to air, releases to water, releases to land, use of raw materials and natural resources, and also use of energy, energy emission, generation of waste and byproducts, and also land use and use of marine and coastal areas, right? If you do any activity that has those aspects, so we need to consider those activities when we identify the environmental aspects, right? Right. And the environmental impact is the change to the environment, right? If we talk about the terminology, environmental impact is the change to the environment, right? The change can be whether adverse or beneficial, but if we do a change to the environment, then that particular change is the environmental impact, right? Right. This is the standard requirement. So within the defined scope of the environmental management system, the organization shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products, services that it can control, and those that it can influence and their associated environmental impacts considering a life cycle perspective. Right. In this clause, the standard says that we need to consider we need to consider uh, our activities, products, and services that we have a control to influence, right? But we need to consider the entire life cycle of our products, services, or our activities, right? A life cycle perspective includes consideration of environmental aspects and impacts at each life cycle stage. The life cycle stage include acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end of life treatment, and final disposal. Right. When we identify the environmental aspects, we need to consider a life cycle perspective. If I give you an example, uh, when a designing team design a product, right? When a designing team design a product, then they can consider it in a life cycle perspective. How they can consider it in a life cycle perspective? Think, suppose the company is I mean, plastic packaging manufacturing company. Then how can they consider the life cycle perspective, right? They can when they design the particular product, right? When they design the particular product, they can consider the raw materials, right? They can use the raw materials that can technically be recycled, right? They can design the product to use technically recyclable raw materials when the production, right? But production team does not have that control, right? Once the designing team design the product, then the production team has to use uh, the production team has to use the raw materials that have defined by the design team. But design team, but the designing team has that control to design the product, right? Design the product in order to use technically recyclable raw materials, right? That kind of influence a design team can make. So if they consider the life cycle, if they consider in a life cycle perspective, they can consider those areas, right? Then how can a production team consider life cycle perspective, right? They can minimize the consumption of raw materials. They can minimize the consumption of energy. They can reduce waste generation, right? Why they need to consider to reduce consumption of energy? Is there any environmental impact by using electricity? Any environmental impact that using can happen by using electricity? But when we generate electricity, right? When we generate electricity, diesel can be used and natural resources can be used. So natural resources depletion can be happen because of generation of the electricity, right? If a production team consider in a life cycle perspective, even though they do not have an impact by using electricity for their production, if they consider in a life cycle perspective, they can consider to reduce their energy consumption. Why? They can have an influence on energy generation process, right? They can have an influence to reduce the raw material natural resource depletion, right? And then suppose that as a result of the production, wastewater generation can be happen, right? Once wastewater is generated, normally what the companies do is they treat that wastewater using ETP or wastewater treatment plant. Once they treat the wastewater, there can be two things. One is treated wastewater, and the other thing is the sludge, right? So then they have to dispose that treated wastewater and the sludge. If they do not consider in a life cycle perspective, they can dispose, they can hand over the sludge to a waste collector, and they can hand over or they can release that treated wastewater to a municipal drainage or a water body or to the ground. But if they think in a life cycle perspective, they are responsible of they are responsible of final disposal of those treated wastewater and sludge. So they cannot hand over to any waste collector. They cannot hand over sludge to any waste collector. They have to check the waste collectors' licenses, qualifications, and they have to check what is the end final disposal of that sludge. So those kind of things they need to consider if they consider life cycle perspective, right? They cannot end the process once they hand over the sludge to a waste collector, right? So they consider in a life cycle perspective, they need to think about the final disposal of the waste or sludge or wastewater, right? They have to have that control, and they need to influence those waste collectors. They need to influence to dispose those waste and sludge, whatever it is, in a proper manner in order to reduce the impact to the environment, right? And then standard says the organization shall determine potential emergency situations, including those that can have an environmental impact, right? When determining environmental aspects, the organization shall take into account normal and abnormal conditions, change, including planned or new developments, and new or modified activities, products, and services, and even potential emergency situations. Right, right. When we consider the activities in organization to identify environmental aspects, there can be normal routine activities and also abnormal non-routine activities. We have to consider both normal and abnormal conditions, right? Suppose when uh, when we manufacture a product, a particular machine needs to be operated. So machine operation is a normal condition and normal activity, right? But what if there is a breakdown, right? What if there is a breakdown of the machine? Then there can be certain environmental aspects of breakdown when they repair the breakdown. There can be certain environmental aspects when they repair the breakdown, right? That's why when we identify the environmental aspects, we need to consider both normal and abnormal conditions, right? Both normal and abnormal conditions. If you identify the environmental aspects of a particular machine, then you consider the normal machine operation and also machine maintenance. And if breakdown happens, then you need to consider the breakdown repair as well. Right. So I gave you a few examples of normal and abnormal conditions. Right. Then the standard says we need to consider potential emergency situations. Why we need to consider emergency situations? Why we need to consider? Why do we need to consider emergency situations? Think there is a flood, right? Uh, in end of last year, we had a big flood. So in some organizations, uh, their wastewater treatment plants had been flooded, right? Once a wastewater treatment plant had been flooded, then those untreated wastewater can be mixed up with flood water, and also the wastewater treatment plant. There can be certain breakdowns, malfunctions of wastewater treatment plants. So when there are emergencies, right? When there are emergencies, there can be certain environmental aspects and impacts from those environmental aspects. So we need to consider those potential emergency situations, right? We need to imagine, we need to identify what are the potential emergency situations. Once we identify the potential emergency situations, we need to identify the potential environmental aspects from those potential emergency situations, right? And also standard says we need to consider changes. We need to consider changes. The changes can be included planned or new developments, and also modified activities, products and services, right? I think during the last session, during the first session, Rasita had uh, explained clause number 6.3, which means dedicated for changes, right? In organizations, time to time they introduce new products, new services, and even they introduce new machines to their production lines, right? Sometimes they build new infrastructures. So whatever a change in the organization, before that change, we need to assess we need to identify the environmental aspects from those changes as well, right? When we do a construction activity in the premises, we need to identify the environmental aspects that can happen due to those construction activities, right? Once we identify the environmental aspects, if those environmental aspects are significant, then we need to take actions to minimize the significance of those identified environmental aspects, right? So whenever there is a change, right? Whenever there is a change, before we do the change, we need to identify the environmental aspects, and we need to take actions if there are any significant environmental aspects, right? Right. And then standard says the organization shall determine those aspects that have or can have significant environmental impact, right? Significant environmental aspects can result in risk and opportunities associated with their adverse or beneficial environmental impacts, right? So environmental aspects not only have adverse environmental impacts. Sometimes there can be certain beneficial environmental impacts as well, right? So we need to identify both adverse and beneficial environmental impacts, right? Then the organization shall communicate its significant environmental aspects among the various levels and functions of the organization as appropriate. I think when you talk about clause number 7.3, which means awareness, there is a requirement. The employees need to be aware of their relevant environmental aspects and their impacts to the environment, right? So the same thing repeats here again. The organization shall communicate significant environmental aspects and their environmental impacts, right? Suppose if uh, if the emission to the environment is a significant environmental aspect from the boiler, then the boiler operator should have the awareness about that significant environmental aspects and the impact due to that aspect, right? So the relevant environmental aspects and impacts, we need to communicate with relevant parties along with their actions, right? And here there is a document requirement. The standard says the following shall be available as documented information. The first one is environmental aspects and associated environmental impacts. So we need to document the environmental aspects and impacts and criteria used to determine its significant environmental aspects and also significant environmental aspects. So in the standard, it has given us the freedom, right? It has given us the freedom to determine our own criteria to identify significant environmental aspects, right? Once we identify the environmental aspects related to our activities, processes, products, and services, right? We need to identify what are the significant environmental aspects. To identify those significant environmental aspects, the standard has given us the freedom to determine our own criteria for that. So we need to document that criteria we had used to identify the significant environmental aspects. Right. Once we identify the significant environmental aspects, then we need to have a list of those significant environmental aspects. So in here, there are three document requirements. The first one is the environmental aspects and associated environmental impacts, right? And the second one is the criteria used to determine its significant environmental aspects. And the third one is significant environmental aspects, which means we need to have a separate list of significant environmental aspects. Right. If we talk about the changes between 2015 and 2026 versions, right? In 2015 version, there is a word called reasonable foreseeable, right? But in when we comes to 2026 version, the term has been replaced by potential emergency situations, right? In 2015 versions, there was a term called reasonable foreseeable emergencies. Reasonable foreseeable emergencies. But that particular term has been replaced with uh, potential emergency situations, right? So reasonable foreseeable word has been replaced with potential, the word potential, right? So when we comes to 2026 version, we need to do imaginations, right? What would happen to this facility? Uh, what potential emergencies? What would be the potential emergencies to this facility? So once we identify those potential emergencies, then we need to consider environmental aspects from those potential emergencies as well, right? And in this standard, right? In this standard, they have given a big, uh, considerable weightage to life cycle perspective, right? They have talked about the life cycle perspective, right? The life cycle perspective. When we consider life cycle perspective, we need to consider those life cycle stages include acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end of life treatment, and final disposal. Right? If I talk more about this, right? Uh, think there is a company called X, right? There is a company called X. The particular company is a multinational company, and that company, let's say, is a brand, is a clothing brand, right? That particular company is a clothing brand. and the company has given an order to a garment factory, right? The company has given an order for a particular garment factory, right? But the company does not have a control about of the garment factory's operation, right? But a company doesn't have the control of the garment factory's operation, right? Then how they can influence? Then how they can influence to that particular garment factory? There are a lot of examples that big clothing brands expect their manufacturing partners, which means garment factories, to certify with ISO 14001 standard and carbon calculations and the sustainability related standards. They expect their manufacturers to be certified for sustainable related standards. That's another example of life cycle consideration. Even though they do not have direct control of the manufacturing process, they influence their manufacturers to align their operations with the requirements of particular ISO standards, right? That kind of influence they can do when they consider about life cycle perspective, right? It's another example for that life cycle perspective, right? I think now you have a good understanding about environmental aspect and environmental impact. So now we are going to do a case study. So during this case study, you need to select a particular operation in your organization and you need to identify the environmental aspects and environmental impacts, right? And also, I expect you to identify the significant environmental aspects as well. So you have to define, right? You have to define an appropriate criteria to identify the significant environmental aspects. So before you start the case study, right? Before you start the case study, I will support you to develop a format for that, right? Right. I hope everyone can see the Excel, right? Uh, can you see the Excel? Right. I hope everyone can see the Excel. So we are going to develop a format to identify environmental aspects and then we are going to identify significant environmental aspects and also we are going to identify the impacts of those environmental aspects. I prefer if everyone can use an Excel. If you don't have access to an Excel, then you can simply use a paper and pen, right? But I expect you to share your work in the WhatsApp group. So first, we need to consider the activity, right? Activity, right? As an example, I will get generate operation, right? right? Then you need to identify whether this activity a normal, abnormal, or emergency, right? You need to identify whether this activity a normal, abnormal, or emergency. I will add another column for activity type of the activity, right? Uh, so then this activity type can be normal, abnormal, or emergency. So I will let's have a drop down for this, right? Then environmental aspects, right? And then environmental impact, right? And once we identify the environmental impacts, then we need to assess based on our own developed criteria whether this aspect is a significant one or not. So let's use a simple. So let's use a simple criteria to identify the significant environmental aspects like likelihood and severity, right? And we get RPN number as a multiplication of this likelihood and the severity, right? So we need to right. We will rate from 1 to 5 for both likelihood and severity. Then we get RPN number from the multiplication of likelihood and severity, right? Likelihood we define as the likelihood of occurrence of the particular environmental aspect, and severity is the severity of the environmental impact, right? And once we get the RPN, then we need to determine significant environmental aspects, right? So if we consider the significant environmental aspects as ones that has the RPN above 20, then we have a criteria, right? So we consider the environmental aspects that have the RPN more than 20 as significant environmental aspects. Without then අපිට then we can determine whether they are significant or not. Right. So as of now, we will fill this as your environmental aspect and impact identification document. So if I will provide one example. When we consider the generator operation is a normal activity, Generate operation is a normal activity. Then what is the environmental aspects from generate operation? One aspect is emit gases. Emit gases. And what could be the environmental impact of this particular environmental aspect? Air pollution. Right. Then if we need to rate for the likelihood and the severity, we need to have a criteria for that as well, right? We need to have a criteria for that as well. Since this is just a case study, we will take likelihood as a minimum likelihood as one and maximum likelihood of occurrence as number five. So since a generator is operated, if you say 4 hours per day, then we rate this as three. But when we are doing a serious environmental aspect impact study, you need to provide specific instructions and guidelines for this rating criteria, right? And the severity of this air pollution, let's say if we rate as four, right? Four. So RPN is 12, then this is not a significant environmental aspect, right? So I want you to take 15 minutes and identify one particular activity, right? Identify one particular operation in your organization and list down the activities under that operation and also identify the environmental aspects and impacts and rate for that environmental aspects and impacts and identify whether the particular aspect is significant or not. So you can take 15 minutes. I think 10 minutes would be enough. So once you're done with this activity, you can share your work in the WhatsApp group, right? If you have any questions, you can ask now. Right. If you still can see my Excel, uh, you can see criteria that they have used to rate those likelihood and severity. If we give one, if once a month or less, and if once a week we give two, if once a day we give three, if several times a day we give four, if it is a continuous thing, then we give five. And for severity, if it is inside premises and no impact to the environment and no complaint, then we give one. And if minor impacts within the plant or complaint, then we give two. And outside premises, minor impact, inside plant, plant, aquatic, and air, then we give three. And affect, if it affects to the global environmental conditions, and if there can be community complaints, then we give four. And if it is a significant catastrophic issue or community is affected significantly, then we give three, right? So you can use this criteria to rate for likelihood and severity. So when you rate the likelihood, you should consider the aspect, and when you rate for the severity, you should think about the impact, right? You should think about the impact. Right. If I explain this further, think two companies, right? One company has a boiler about, let's say, 3 ton, and the other company has a boiler of a half a ton, right? So both boilers are operated, uh, let's say, continuously operated. So then, for likelihood, we should rate five for both boilers. But when we consider about the severity of the impact, right? When we consider about the severity of the impact, then we can rate two for half a ton boiler, and we can rate three for 3 ton boiler, because uh, the impact is very minimum from a half a ton boiler, but there can be a significant impact from that 3 ton boiler, because it emits a huge amount of gas, and sometimes uh, there can be certain particles, right? And also when you rate for this severity, when you identify the severity, you can consider the existing controls as well, right? Let's say there are two boilers, right? There are two boilers. One boiler has a scrubber system to remove ash from the emission, and the other boiler does not have that kind of a scrubber system, right? So one boiler has a scrubber system, and the other boiler does not have the scrubber system. Then what will happen? Then we can give a low rating for the boiler that has a scrubber system, and we can give a higher rating for the boiler that do not have a scrubber system. So when you rate for a particular environmental impact, then you can consider about the existing controls as well. If there are strong controls, strong, robust controls, then we all know that impact is very minimum. But if we don't have a good control mechanism, then the impact can be higher than compared to a one with a good control mechanism. Once you're done, please share your work in the WhatsApp group. You can ask questions while you are doing the case study. So if you have questions, I'll be able to help. Right. Only one has shared the work, right? I will give you another 3 minutes. Hope everyone can share your work. Right. Anne has shared her work. But the thing is, she has identified laboratory bench work as an activity, and it is a normal activity and environmental aspects, chemical and biological waste generation, and environmental impact, water and soil pollution. So likelihood is 4 and severity is 5. So then she has identified that as a significant environmental aspect. But it's good work. But I think if I told you to consider one operation in your organization, and then you have to do this assessment for several activities under that operation, right? This would be better if she has identified laboratory operation as the operation and several activities and the laboratory operation. So laboratory bench work is only one activity. So if it's better if you can identify more activities and more environmental aspects due to those activities. Right. Rasinth has done a good work. I think he has identified the boil operation as the operation and identified several activities. I think Rasinth, you have lowered the value for significant environmental aspects, right? It's perfectly okay since the standard has given freedom for you to determine the criteria to identify the significant environmental aspects. And with the you have considered the RPN, I think more than 10 for significant environmental aspects, right? I ask this because you have identified fire in storeroom. You have identified that as an emergency, and the RPN is 10 out of 25. But you have identified that as a significant environmental aspect. Right. So let's move forward. I think when I check your work, I think you have understood the concept and the requirements of the and requirements and environmental aspects. So good job, team. Right. If everyone can see my Excel, you can see I have identified generator explosion as an emergency. Right. I have identified generator explosion as an emergency, but the likelihood for generator operation is one. It is a very rare case, and but the severity is pretty much high. It is 5, right? Then the RPN is 5. Then that hasn't been identified as a significant environmental aspect. I mean, gas emission from that generator explosion hasn't been identified as a significant environmental aspect. But uh, as of this scoring criteria, right? As of this scoring criteria, uh, any aspect related to a emergency, right? Any aspect related to a emergency will not be a significant environmental aspect. Why? Because likelihood of happening a generator explosion or likelihood of happening an emergency is very low, right? Is very low. Then if we don't get at least 4 for likelihood, then you will not get that as a significant environmental aspect, right? Which means this criteria is not strong enough to identify proper significant environmental aspects, which means we need to develop this criteria further by considering more things as the criteria to identify significant environmental aspects, right? Since we consider compliance obligation, we can get legal requirements as one criteria as well. And also, if you want to consider controls directly, then you can get control as another criteria, right? So you can further develop this criteria to identify proper significant environmental aspects. If your criteria is weak, then you will not be able to identify proper significant environmental aspects, right? As of me, I think the criteria that we have used is not good enough to identify proper significant environmental aspects. So a further development for this criteria is definitely needed. So when you practically implement uh, environmental management system in your organization, so you should first consider your operations, right? Your potential emergencies and your products and your services, and then according to that, you can determine a proper criteria to identify significant environmental aspects. We already have mentioned likelihood, severity, then you can consider legal requirements, right? When you consider legal requirements, if there is a legal requirement related to the particular environmental aspect, then you can rate that as 5, right? Because there is a risk. If there is a legal requirement related to that particular environmental aspect, then there is a risk, right? So you can identify, you can rate. If there is a legal requirement, you can rate that as 5. If there isn't a legal requirement related to that, then you can rate that as 3 or 1, right? Then if you consider controls, right? If you consider controls, if there aren't any controls to any proper control to control that environmental aspects for the operation, then you can rate as 1. If there are controls, but those are not very effective, then you can rate that as 3. If there are controls, I think that rating should be changed, right? If there aren't any controls, then you can rate that as 5, right? You can rate that as 5 because if there aren't controls, there aren't any control, the risk is high, right? So you should give a higher score for no controls. Then if there are controls, but the controls are not very effective, then you can rate that as 3. If there are controls and the controls are very effective, then you can rate that as 1. So if you consider more criterias, you will get the RPN by multiplying all the criterias, right? If you want, if you think that fits, you can get a weightage for different criterias as well. Anyhow, you need to determine a proper criteria in order to identify proper environmental aspects. If your criteria is weak, then you will not be able to identify proper significant environmental aspects. Right. So you can further develop this by adding legislation and existing controls. And even you can consider the quantity, right? Even you can consider the quantity, right? If if we consider the quantity, right? If we consider the quantity, if a generator explosion is happen, then gas emission is very high, right? The gas emission is very high. Then you can rate that as 5. You can rate the quantity for gas emission due to generator explosion as 5 because the emitted gas emission is very high compared to the normal generator operation, right? So by adding more criterias and also by considering several areas, then you can identify proper significant environmental aspects, right? You can identify proper significant environmental aspects. Yes, there are regulations for gas emission, then you can rate that as 5. If generator is running without any safety mechanisms or controls, then you can even rate that as 5. Then if you take the multiplication of all these criterias, then you will get a higher number, right? But the maximum would be, I think, maximum would be 3,125. Then you can define a level for significant environmental aspects, right? So you should define a proper criteria to identify significant environmental aspects. Then only you can identify proper significant environmental aspects. So you should understand why we need to identify significant environmental aspects, right? Because we take actions or we address those significant environmental aspects first, right? So we give priority for those significant environmental aspects. But if we have failed to identify the proper significant environmental aspects, then we will not pay our attention or we will not focus on those areas, right? Then the whole purpose of doing this assessment will not be achieved, right? So I repeat again, if you want to identify good, proper significant environmental aspects to pay your attention, right? Then you need to have a proper criteria to identify significant environmental aspects, right? That criteria can be more specific for your operation or for your organization. The standard has given the freedom by limiting the criteria for standard requirement, right? So we'll move forward. Right. Then, since Rasita had covered uh, the planning action parts, I will not go deep into that, but I think it's better to touch that area as well, right? Here is planning actions. When we plan actions, the standard says the organization shall plan to take actions to address its significant environmental aspects determined in clause 6.1.2, right? In standard, demand us to plan actions for significant environmental aspects, right? For significant environmental aspects. So once we identify the significant environmental aspects, so we need to take actions to minimize or to reduce the significance of those identified significant environmental aspects, right? For that, we have to have proper action plans, right? So now you should understand the linkage between all these. When you identify significant environmental aspects, you have to consider routine and normal, abnormal, and potential emergencies, right? You need to identify, you need to consider normal operations, abnormal operations, and even potential emergencies, right? Then you have to set a criteria to identify significant environmental aspects and identify significant environmental aspects. Then you need to list down the significant environmental aspects, right? Once you identify the significant environmental aspects, then you need to take actions to address those significant environmental aspects, right? So those actions, either we can have a separate action plan to address those significant environmental aspects, or we can link uh, those actions with other processes, right? You can see under part B, the organization shall plan how to implement the actions into environmental management system process or integrate the actions into other business processes, right? So you can integrate the actions to other business processes as well. But the outcome should be you have to address those significant environmental aspects, right? Right. Then we'll directly move into clause number 8. I think in previous sessions, clause number 7 had been covered. So we'll move directly to the clause number 8. In clause number 8, we talk about operational planning and control under clause number 8.1. Right? Under clause number 8.1, we talk about operational planning and control. So the environmental management system must control or influence externally provided processes, products, or services and define the level of control in documented information. And the idea of maintaining processes means that an organization will need to ensure that processes remain fit to purpose. Right? The new wording is the processes needed for 8.1 shall be available as documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the process have been carried out as planned. Right. In a previous version of standard, this requirement wasn't there, but in the new version, there is a requirement. We need to maintain documented evidence, right? We need to maintain documented evidence to the extent necessary to have confidence that the process have been carried out as planned. So I will explain further about this. So if we go to the operational planning and control requirements of this standard, the organization shall establish, implement, control, and maintain the processes needed to meet environmental management system requirements and implement actions determined in clause number 6. Right. So we have determined certain actions in clause number 6 uh, to address significant environmental aspects, to address compliance obligations, and to address the other risk and opportunities. Right? We have identified certain actions, and in this clause, they expect us to establish, implement, control, and maintain processes need to meet the environmental management requirements and to implement the actions determined in clause number 6. Right. By establishing operating criteria for the processes, implementing control of the processes in accordance with the operating criteria. Right. Right. If we take an example, suppose that we have identified uh, gas emission of the boiler, right? Think we have identified that as a significant environmental aspects as a significant environmental aspect. Then we need to determine actions to control that. So what would be the actions if that particular uh, generator does not have a stack? We can implement a stack. Why we need to implement a stack? If we implement a stack, then we can release that emission at a very higher level. So then the pollution to the uh, ground area would be very minimum if we can release that gas at a higher at an elevated level, right? If the noise emission is identified as a significant environmental aspect, then we can implement acoustic barriers, right, for that generator. Then the emitted noise to the environment can be reduced, right? Those kind of actions we need to identify. If we consider the boil operation, right? If we consider the boil operation, think you have a biomass boiler, which means you need to use briquettes or firewood as fuel for the boiler, right? Then if you have a big, I mean, about 2 to 3 ton boiler, then the biomass consumption is can be significantly high, right? Then how can you supply the resources? I mean, supply firewood for the biomass boiler? Then definitely you'd have to cut down trees. Even your suppliers have to cut down trees. Once you cut down trees, or once you have influence to cut down trees, then you put a big impact into the environment. Then definitely you should have identified that as a significant environmental aspect, and you need to have controls to minimize the significance of the particular environmental aspect. How you can do it? One thing you can do is you can purchase only sustainable woods, which means those firewoods not directly coming from destroying forests or trees. Either those trees are those trees are grown intended to cut down for firewood, or either you can use the wood waste of from certain industries, right? Either you can use briquettes. So then you can implement the controls in order to minimize the significance of the particular environmental aspect, right? If you consider the emission from the boiler as a significant environmental aspect of a boiler that has not a scrubber system, right? Then you can implement a scrubber system to remove particles and ash from the emitted gas from the boiler, right? Those kind of actions you can take. But the thing is, you need to integrate those actions with your business process. Otherwise, those actions would not be sustained, right? Those actions would not be sustained. And you should have controls for those actions as well, right? In this clause number 8.1, we talk about these controls. So then how we implement controls? How we implement controls? So what are the controls? So there is a hierarchy of controls you can consider, right? The most effective way of controlling a thing is elimination, right? The most effective way of controlling things is elimination. If you have significant environmental aspect, if you have a particular significant environmental aspect, if there is a possibility to eliminate in that aspect, then definitely you have to eliminate that aspect. That's the best way to control those environmental aspects. And if you cannot eliminate that, then you can consider about a substitution, right? Then you can consider about a substitution, right? If you use, I mean, if you use grid electricity, if you use grid electricity uh, for your operations, right? We know you cannot eliminate the electricity consumption from a production plant, but you can substitute that with sustainable energies. I mean, you can take a portion from solar or wind power, right? You can consider those substitution options, and also you can provide trainings, awareness, instructions to the operators and the workers. Then those things we consider as administrative controls, right? You can either use these controls individually or you can use these controls as a combination, right? And then the organization shall control, plan changes, and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking actions to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. When you do a change, right? When you do a change to your process, to your facility, infrastructure, to your products, whatever changes you are going to do, before doing that change, you have to plan for that change. When the planning, when in the planning stage, you need to assess the possible potential environmental aspects from the planned change, right? Then you identify those as significant, then you have to take controls to minimize that significance. And then the organization shall ensure that externally provided processes, products, or services that are relevant to the intended outcomes of the environmental management system are controlled or influenced. The type and extent of control or influence to be applied shall be defined within the environmental management system, right? If you get externally provided processes, products, or services, then you need to consider controlling or influencing those external provided process, products, and services in order to minimize the impact to the environment, right? In order to minimize the impact to the environment. If we take that boiler example again, right? If you run if you operate a firewood biomass boiler, right? You can shift to sustainable woods, right? You can shift to sustainable woods. But if you cannot find a supplier, then you can influence your existing supplier to get that sustainable woods for you. And as evidence of they are supplying only sustainable woods, there are certain certificates they can take. You can influence them to get those certificates and get only sustainable firewoods, right? So he's a supplier, right? He's a supplier, and you purchase firewood from that particular supplier, then you can have an influence on him, right? If you hand over your waste to a waste collector, right? If you hand over your waste to a waste collector, then time to time you can audit that particular waste collector to check whether he dispose the waste in the agreed manner, right? Or else you can suppose you hand over your treated wastewater or your storage to a gully service, then you need to check whether that particular gully bowser hand over that storage or wastewater to operating plant as they agreed. How can you do that? You can ask for invoices, photographs, even you can randomly audit his operation as well. So that level of control you need to have, especially when you consider life cycle perspective, right? If you are if you buy a big amount from a particular supplier, you can influence him to get sustainable related certificates. By influencing for that, you can influence him to align his operations as per the requirements of those sustainable standards. Right. If we talk about internal control for your processes, right? Uh, we talked about elimination and substitution. For administrative purpose, right? You can develop certain SOPs, working instructions, and you can display those SOPs and working instructions at working areas. You can provide trainings, awareness for operators and workers on how to minimize the environmental impact from the activities, right? That kind of controls you can have internally. And the standard says, consistent with the life cycle perspective, the organization shall establish controls as appropriate to ensure that its environmental requirements are addressed in the design development process for products or services, considering each life cycle stage, right? Think you use recyclable materials for your packages, right? For your pack as your packaging materials, right? Then already you have a certain level of control through the life cycle. Why? Once a consumer consumes the product, he or she definitely will get rid of the packing material. If that packing material can be recycled, then the impact on the environment is definitely less, right? You can consider those things when you design or develop your processes or products or services, right? And then determine its environmental requirements for procurement of products and services as appropriate. So we can take again that sustainable wood firewood purchasing for the boiler as example for this, right? You can ask, uh, you can even ask sustainability related certifications from your suppliers. You can even include those sustainable related certificates as qualifications when you select a supplier, right? You can do several things and communicate its relevant environmental requirements to external providers, including contractors, right? Sometimes uh, your own organizational workers have a good discipline. Since suppose if you have a good environmental culture within your organization, then definitely your own workers, your own staff will adhere to the controls you have established. But when subcontractors comes into the organization, they can violate certain things. In that cases, you have to communicate clearly your practices and your controls to the external providers, and you have to make sure they adhere with those controls, right? And then consider the need to provide information about potential significant environmental impacts associated with the transportation or delivery, use, end life treatment, and final disposal of its products and services. Right. We talked about this earlier. And the processes for 8.1 shall be available as documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence they are carried out as planned. How we fulfill the last requirement actually? How we fulfill the last requirement actually? Right. If suppose you provide certain instructions to the boiler operator to minimize the environmental impact due to boil operation, right? You provide suppose you provide certain instructions to the boil operator. The standard expect you to provide that in writing. So you can prepare SOP or working instruction, right? Then you can display that working instruction and SOP in the boiler room, right? You can display that in the boiler room. Beyond that, you should have the confidence. You should have the confidence that they are carried out as planned, right? You should have the confidence that they are carried out as planned. So purchase you purchase sustainable wood chips or firewood from your firewood supplier, but you should have the confidence that they are carried out as planned. And how you can get that confidence? You can ask certain certificates from them. You can maintain those certificates as evidence, right? You can maintain those certificates as evidence. Suppose in your wastewater treatment plant, right? In your wastewater treatment plant, before you release wastewater to let's say to municipal drainage, before you release treated wastewater to the municipal drainage, you need to treat that wastewater to a certain level, right? Then how can you have a confidence that all the operations are carried out as planned? You can check, you can analyze properties of treated wastewater. If you have an internal laboratory, you can check its color, you can check the pH, you can check the chlorine level, you can check several things. You can maintain those records as evidence for this document requirement demand by the standard, right? Then you can show those records during audit, and even you can have a confidence that all the processes are carried out as planned. If the treated wastewater is within the defined parameters, then once you tested it, if it is within the defined parameters, then you have the confidence, right? You can even maintain those records as evidence, right? Then let's move into clause number 8.2, emergency preparedness and response. Right. In clause number 6.1.2, right, we identified potential emergencies. Is it? Yes, we identified potential emergencies. It is the clause number 6.1.2 is where we identify potential emergencies, right? Clause number 6.1.2 is where we identify potential emergencies, right? Once we identify potential emergencies, in the same clause, we identify uh, potential environmental aspects and even their impacts, right? And then we analyzed, then we evaluated those environmental aspects and impacts, and we identified significant environmental aspects, right? Then we need to prepare to respond those emergencies. If there is an emergency, we need to respond for that emergency, right? To respond that emergency, we need to prepare for that, right? In clause number 8.2, discuss about that emergency preparedness and response, right? The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain its processes needed to prepare for and respond to the potential emergency situations determined in 6.1.2. The organization shall prepare to respond by planning actions to prevent or mitigate adverse environmental impacts from emergency situations, respond to actual emergency situations, take actions to prevent or mitigate consequences of emergency situations appropriate to the magnitude of the emergency and potential environmental aspect, periodically test the planned response actions where applicable, and periodically review and revise the processes and planned response actions in particular after the occurrence of emergency situations or tests, and provide relevant information and training related to emergency preparedness and response as appropriate to relevant interested parties, including persons working under its control. Right. We will try to understand those requirements using fire as a potential emergency. Right. We will try to understand these requirements. Right. Suppose we identify a fire as a potential emergency, right? Then what if there is a fire? Let's say in a chemical manufacturing plant, there is a fire. There is a fire. What will happen? What will happen? Right. Due to the fire, uh, there can be explosion. So a gas emission can happen, right? A gas emission can happen, right? And once you use water to extinguish that fire, then chemical contaminated wastewater is generated, right? Chemical contaminated wastewater is generated. And chemical contaminated, even solid water, solid waste can be generated, right? Chemical contaminated solid waste can be generated, right? We take those three only as of now, right? So we have three environmental aspects due to the fire. The one is emission, gas emission, and the second one is chemical contaminated waste water generation, and the third one is chemical contaminated solid waste generation. So let's take those three as possible environmental aspects, and suppose when we analyze those environmental aspects, chemical contaminated solid waste and wastewater, uh, we have suppose we have identified those as significant environmental aspects, right? So then when we establish, implement, and maintain processes need to prepare for and respond to the potential emergency situations, right? We need to have a proper plan. As per the standard, we need to have a proper plan. In that plan, we have to take actions. We have to identify actions to reduce the environmental impact by considering the significant environmental aspects, right? If we identify chemical contaminated wastewater generation as a significant environmental aspect, then we need to have certain controls. What kind of controls we can take for that? What kind of controls? We can, if if there is a possibility to flow that chemical contaminated wastewater into municipal drainages through our inside drainages, we can implement a mechanism to close those internal drainages to prevent the water enter to the municipal drainages, right? So then then in that cases, we have to plan how we close those drainages, right? If you use sandbags, then you should have easy access for those sandbags, right? If you use gates to close those drainages, then you should install gates at the drainages, right? Then even it's not enough. So then you have identified controls, then you have infrastructure to that, right? Then if there is a fire, who will close those gates or who will put those sandbags into drainages? So then we need to assign responsibilities to a particular task, right? So we can assign certain members in the fire team, or we can assign several members in departments to close those gates or to put those sandbags into drainages, right? So first we need to identify the action, then we need to implement the infrastructure, right? Then we need to assign responsibility to those tasks. Even it's not enough. Then we need to provide clear instructions to them how the particular task get done, right? We need to provide instructions. So those instructions also need to be included in your emergency preparedness and response plan, right? Then standard says you need to periodically test the planned response actions where applicable. How you are going to periodically test those planned response actions? If you are working in an organization, you should be familiar with fire drills, right? You should be familiar with fire drills. In organizations, they need when they need to check their emergency response plan and their capabilities to respond those emergencies, they organize drills, right? You can even organize fire drills. So during the fire drill, normally the most of the organizations do is they only focus on evacuation, right? They only focus on evacuation. Normally they do not focus on environmental related things, right? But if you have ISO 14001 standard implemented in your organization, then you need to consider that environmental things as well. So once you do a fire drill, right? Once you do a fire drill, you can check whether the actions you have determined to control the impact to the environment is properly executed, or you have the capacity to execute those actions. If not, then you need to take corrective actions for those things, or you need to improve your process, right? And then the standard says you need to provide relevant information and training related to emergency preparedness and response as appropriate to relevant interested parties, including persons working under its control, right? If contractors work in your organization, then you need to provide trainings and relevant information to them as well, right? To that, if we since we take fire as the example for potential emergency, right? Then the organizations provide fire trainings to their fire team, right? Provide fire training to their fire team. So then the organizations train their teams to respond those emergencies, right? So those kind of things normally the organizations do to respond for emergencies. So we took fire as an example, right? There are a lot of potential emergencies, right? Even in even after Ditwa, some organizations had identified ETP flood as an emergency, but they had faced that kind of ETP flood for the first time in their organization, right? For the first time in their organization. But if but what if they had identified? What if they had identified that as a potential emergency? Then definitely they can take controls when the rain is increased or when flood alerts are given. They can use bowsers to transport their untreated wastewater to a safe location or external treatment plant, and even they can uh, hold their production in order to prevent wastewater generation, right? Those things, those actions, they can take only if they have identified those things as potential emergencies, and they have documented, they have determined those actions to respond for emergencies, right? And here in the new standard, the processes needed for 8.2 shall be available as documented information to extent necessary to have confidence that the process carried out as planned, right? So you have to strengthen your emergency preparedness and response plans. You need to provide specific instructions. You need to assign responsibilities, even, right? So your documentation part need to be strengthened as per the as per ISO 14001 2026 standard. Right. Now let's again try to identify the link between these clauses. Right. In clause number 6.1.2, you identified potential emergencies and you identified environmental aspects from those potential emergencies. And then you determined actions to address those significant environmental aspects. And then, clause number 8.2, we talk about emergency preparedness and response, right? When we audit or when we do consultation for organizations, in some organizations, what we see is we do not see link between these clauses, right? They have identified certain environmental aspects of the emergencies, but they haven't addressed those significant environmental aspects in their emergency preparedness and response plan. But when you implement a proper, robust system in your organization, you need to maintain that linkage, right? If you have identified significant environmental aspects related to potential emergencies at 6.1.2, then in your emergency preparedness and response plan, the actions you have determined needs to be included in your emergency preparedness and response plan as well, right? In more detail, in more detail, right? Okay. I think now you have a clear understanding about the linkage between those clauses, right? So we link 6.1.2 with 8.1 and 8.2, right? Then let's move into clause number 9. So now in PDCA cycle, we have covered planning part and do part, and now we have moved into check part. It is for monitoring, measuring, analysis, and evaluation. If I read the standard requirement first, the organization shall evaluate its environmental performance and the effectiveness of the environmental management system, right? Environmental performance and the effectiveness of the environmental management system. The organization shall determine what needs to be monitored, right? What needs to be monitored, measured, and analyzed. Monitored, measured, and analyzed. The methods for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation as applicable to ensure valid results. The criteria against which the organization shall evaluate its environmental performance and appropriate indicators. When the monitoring and measuring shall be performed, when the results from monitoring and measuring shall be analyzed and evaluated, the organization shall ensure that calibrated or verified monitoring and measurement equipment is used as maintained as appropriate. The organization shall communicate relevant environmental performance information both internally and externally as identified in communication processes and required by its compliance obligation. Appropriate documented information shall be available as evidence of monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation results. Right. So first, let's try to understand the meaning of monitoring, right? The meaning of monitoring. In ISO 14001 2026 standard, define monitoring as determining the status of a system, a process, or an activity, right? Monitoring is determining the status of a system, process, or activity. Determining the status. What's that mean? Determining the status, right? If you have set objectives, the status would be achieved or not achieved, right? The status would be achieved or not achieved, right? If you test the parameters of treated wastewater, right? The status would be within the limits or off the limit, right? Then monitoring, monitoring part is mostly qualitative, right? Monitoring part is mostly qualitative. But if you take measuring, measurement is process to determine a value, right? Measurement is process to determine a value, right? You need to measure the pH of the treated wastewater. You need to measure the residual chlorine level of treated wastewater, right? You need to measure COD and BOD of treated wastewater, right? You need to measure the boundary noise, right? You need to measure the smoke opacity of the emitted gas from your boiler. So those are the measurements, right? Those are the measurements. So standard says you need to have processes to monitor, measure, and even for analysis, right? Even for analysis and evaluation as well, right? So monitoring is determining the status, and measurement is the process of getting a value, right? And what is analysis and evaluation? What is analysis and evaluation? Right. Think you have treated wastewater reports, right? Treated monthly internal treated wastewater reports. Suppose you have those 10 to 12 reports, right? Then what you need to do is you can identify the trend, right? You can identify the trend, right? You can graphically illustrate the values for the parameters, right? If a trend is increasing, let's say the BOD value is increasing for last 2 to 3 months, then there is a possibility to BOD value to increase further the accepted level, right? Then based on that analysis, you can take preventive actions, right? Based on that analysis, you can take preventive actions, right? You can check whether there is a malfunction or whether there is a operation control violation. So you can check those things in order to avoid the BOD level getting beyond the accepted limits, right? That kind of analysis standard expects you to do, right? So one thing, you need to monitor the status and you need to measure the values and you need to analyze and evaluate the environmental performance using those values and the status, right? You can use appropriate indicators even. Right. So what is an indicator? The standard says, right? The standard says quantitative, qualitative, or binary variable that can be measured or described representing the status of operations, management, conditions, or impact, right? So indicator is a thing we can use to check uh, whether the expected performance is achieved or not, right? Whether the expected performance is achieved or not. If we take uh, energy indicators as example, think you manufacture beer, right? Think you manufacture beer. So when you are manufacturing beer, electricity would be a significant electricity consumption would be a significant environmental aspect, right? So in order to monitor the status of the performance of the environmental performance, you need to set a proper indicator to check whether the expected outcome is achieved or not, right? So you can set an indicator for energy as uh, kilowatt hours per hectoliter, right? Hours per hectoliter to manufacture beer, which means the amount of electricity units you use to manufacture 100 liter of beer, right? You can set a target for that even. And if the certain target is achieved, then you can say that our environmental performance is at a level we expected. If it is not achieved, then you need to take actions as corrective actions for those things. Right. If you see these requirements, uh, the standard says the organization shall communicate relevant environmental performance information both internally and externally. Do we need to communicate our environmental performance externally? Yes, sometimes we have to communicate our environmental performance externally. Any example? Yes. When we apply for environmental protection license, we need to provide test results of our treated wastewater and emissions from our stacks and boundary noise. So those testings, those informations we need to provide to Central Environmental Authority, right? So those communication requirements we identify where? at clause number 7.4, right? Clause number 7.4, 7.4.3. In clause number 7.4.3, right? There is a clause called external communication. External communication. Under this external communication, you need to determine what are the things you need to communicate to external parties, and what are the methods, what is the frequency, when you need to communicate those environmental information to external parties. So those kind of things you need to identify at clause number 7.4.3. Right? Now you see the linkage between these clauses. Right. And now we can move into internal audit part, right? So we have so far covered clause number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9.1, which means we have implemented the major bulk of the management system, right? Once we implement the management system, we need to check whether our management system is good or need to be improved, or we need to identify the areas that we need to improve. For that, we mainly do an internal audit, right? So when we conduct an internal audit, right, the organization shall conduct internal audits as planned intervals to provide information on whether the environmental management system conforms to the organization's own requirements for its environmental management system. The requirements of this document is effectively implemented and maintained. Right. This is the internal audit requirement. So why do you need to do an internal audit? You need to do an internal audit to confirm whether the organization's own requirements for environmental management system is effectively implemented and maintained, and also the requirements of this documents in the sense ISO 14001 2026 standard. So you need to check and you need to verify whether these requirements are effectively implemented and maintained, right? So to check or to get the confirmation or to verify that, you need to conduct an internal audit, right? When you conduct an internal audit, right? When you conduct an internal audit, the organization shall define the audit objectives, audit criteria, and scope for each audit. Select auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process, and ensure that the results of the audits are reported to relevant management. Right. So when you plan an internal audit, right? When you plan an internal audit, you need to set the audit objectives. So why you need to do this audit? You need to check whether the standard requirements and the organizational requirements related to environmental management system is effectively maintained, implemented and maintained. That would be the audit objective. And you need to set the audit criteria and scope, right? You need to set the audit criteria and scope. You need to mention what are the areas you are going to audit, right? And what is the criteria you use for that audit? And also you need to select auditors to conduct this audit, right? To ensure objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. Let's say uh, you have a wastewater treatment plant, right? You assign wastewater treatment plant manager to audit his own operation. What will happen? What will happen? will he identify the non-conformities? I don't think so. He will not identify his own non-conformities, right? So you need to maintain the objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process, right? You need to plan a cross-functional audit process for the audit program. Right? That's how you maintain objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. You can assign internal auditors from several departments and you can audit the entire organization cross-functionally by using auditors from several departments, right? But you need to train your auditors to what? You need to train your auditors to understand the requirements of this standard and also the requirements of your own organization related to environmental management system. And you need to train auditors for auditing ethics and guidelines using ISO 19011 guideline. It is specifically for audits, right? And you need to make sure the audit is conducted as planned and the audit results should be reported to relevant management to take further actions. Right. So there is a documentation requirement as well. The following documented information shall be available: the audit program, evidence of the implementation of audit program, evidence of the audit results. So audit program. So you need to document a proper audit plan, and also you need to take attendance sheets of the closing, opening and closing meetings, and even you need to record or note down all the compliances and non-compliances, and you need to include those both compliances and non-compliances in the audit report, and you need to generate an audit report. So these are the documented requirements under internal audit. Right. So in new version, right? In new version, risk and opportunity, the word risk and opportunity has been deleted and changes affecting the organization has been added. And no explicit requirements to consider risk and opportunity, but as implemented requirements as the whole standard is based on risk-based thinking, right? In here, in new version, they haven't mentioned risk and opportunity part specifically, but in the standard, we know for all ISO standards, we focus risk-based thinking, right? So the requirement is automatically addressed when we focus risk-based thinking, and also requires the organization to define the audit objective and also outline specific documentation to be made available. In previous standard, there wasn't specifically mentioned the exact document requirements under clause number 9.2. But in this standard, they have mentioned that the audit program, evidence of implementation, the audit program, and also evidence of the audit results need to be documented. Right. Right. So let's move into clause number 9.3. It is for management review. So in management review, the standard has given certain inputs to include in the management review meeting. So those inputs are the status of actions from previous management reviews, right? If you are conducting a management review for the first time, then there were no previous management reviews. But if you are conducting the management review for second or later times, then you need to discuss the status of the actions from previous management reviews at the beginning of the management review. මේක අර සමිති වාර්තාව සමිතියට කලින් සමිති වාර්තාව කියවන වගේ වැඩක්. Right. And also changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the environmental management system, the need and expectations of interested parties that are relevant to the environmental management system, including compliance obligations, right? You all know recently the government has issued a new amendment for the Environmental Act, right? Then those things you need to discuss in the management review. So there can be several things that has an impact on the organization's management system, right? And also its significant environmental aspects. During the management system, the significant environmental aspects need to be discussed, right? And also the risk and opportunities. If there are any changes for those things during the management review meeting, those things need to be discussed. And the extent to which environmental objectives has been achieved. And also information on the organization's environmental performance, including trends in nonconformities and corrective actions, monitoring and measurement results, meeting its compliance obligations, and audit results. And also the adequacy of resources, relevant communications from interested parties, including complaints, and also opportunities for continual improvements. Right. Those you need to discuss, you need to mandatorily discuss those things in your management review meeting. Apart from these things, you can discuss several other things related to environmental management system as well. But mandatorily, you need to discuss those things at the management review. Right. So then the results of the management review shall include conclusions on the on the continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the environmental management systems, decisions related to continual improvement opportunities, decisions related to any need for change to the environmental management system, including resources, actions if needed when environmental objectives have not been achieved, opportunities to improve integration of the environmental management system with other business processes if needed, and any implications for the strategic direction of the organization. Documented information shall be available as evidence of the results of the management review. Right. So, which means the standard demands the documented evidence of the results of the management reviews, which means you need to document the meeting minutes, right? You need to document the meeting minutes. So when we take minutes, actually, right, if there are any conclusions, you need to take minutes. If there are any decisions taken, you need to take minutes. If there are actions, if there are any actions proposed, then you need to take minutes. If there are any improvement points as given by the management, you need to take minutes, right? If there are any implications for the strategic direction of the organizations, then you need to take minutes. So basically, you need to take minutes when there are suggestions, decisions, actions, then you need to take minutes for those things, right? So then once you take the minutes, you need to distribute those minutes among relevant interested parties. Basically, the internal interested parties, which means your managers, department heads, sometimes supervisors and operators as well. Right. During the audit, during the audit, the evidence will be checked for conducting management review meeting. So the attendance sheets of the management review, sometimes the presentations will be checked uh, to confirm whether you have addressed all the inputs given in the standard, and also the management review meeting minutes will be checked by the auditor uh, to confirm you have documented evidence for the outcome of the management review. Right. And finally, in clause number 10.1, so now we have completed plan, do, and check parts of PDCA cycle. So we have come to the last section of this management system, which is act phase in PDCA cycle. Clause number 10 is dedicated for that act phase in PDCA cycle. So in the standard, they discuss about continual improvement, right? In clause number 10 is for continual improvement. The organization shall continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the environmental management system to enhance environmental performance by determining opportunities for improvement and implementing necessary actions to achieve the intended outcomes of its environmental management system. Right. So in ISO standards, always they demand continual improvement, not continuous improvement. So what's the difference between this continual improvement and the continuous improvement? Right? In continuous improvement, we do improvements continuously without checking whether they can be sustained or not. We do improvements. But when continual improvement is done, we do a small improvement and check whether that improvement can be sustained or not. If that improvement is sustainable, then we take the second step. It's like climbing on a staircase. So the standard demands and promotes that continual improvement instead of continuous improvement. So when we do improvements, we need to take a small step and then we need to check whether that improvement can be sustained or not. If that improvement is successful, then we can move into the next step. By doing this, we can make sure that the improvements we have made so far is sustainable. Only if there is a failure, we have a risk of only to fail the most recent step only, right? To fail the most recent step only, because we have already verified the previously taken steps can be sustained, right? So when we talk about continual improvement, right, we can identify the improvement opportunities from our analysis we have done in clause number 9.1, right? We can identify the opportunities for improvement. And also we can identify the opportunities for improvement from internal audits as well as management reviews, management review meetings. So those are the areas we get improvement points, we get inputs for continual improvement, right? And then in clause number 10.2, non-conformity and corrective action. So what's a non-conformity? If I read you the definition of the standard itself, right? If I read the definition of the standard itself, a non-conformity is a non-fulfillment of a requirement, right? A non-conformity is a non-fulfillment of a requirement. It's the opposite word of conformity, which is fulfillment of a requirement, right? So the non-conformity is defined as a non-fulfillment of a requirement, right? So where can we identify the non-conformities? Mainly we identify the non-conformities from internal and external audits, right? We mainly identify non-conformities from internal and external audits, right? Apart from that, we can identify non-conformities of our internal processes, right? Where Suppose if certain parameters of treated wastewater is has gone beyond the set limits, then it would be a non-conformity. So it's a non-fulfillment of a requirement. If it says we need to maintain the pH of treated wastewater between 5.5 to 7.5, then we need to maintain the pH of treated wastewater within the given limits. If the limits, if we go beyond limits, then it is a non-fulfillment of the requirement of a requirement. Then that also can be raised as an unconformity. So how we raise those nonconformities? How we raise those nonconformities? In clause number 9.1, when we monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate environmental performance, right? When we monitor, analyze, evaluate, measure environmental performance, then if there is a non-conformity, if a non-fulfillment of a requirement, then we can raise those as non-conformities. What if we identify an unconformity? Then what we need to do? Right. First thing we need to take correction. Right. Immediately we need to correct that nonconformity. Right. Why we need to correct that nonconformity? We need to take immediate actions to control that nonconformity. So that we call as correction. Right. Then we can deal with the consequences, including we can mitigate adverse environmental impacts. So what would, suppose that you identify that pH of treated wastewater at 8 while the limit is 7.5. Then what would be the correction? What would be the correction? You need to stop releasing the wastewater. You need to stop the releasing the treated wastewater. So that would be the immediate step, immediate action to prevent adverse environmental impacts, right? Once you stop releasing the treated wastewater to the environment, then you can take further actions to adjust the pH of the wastewater, and you can recheck the pH of the wastewater. Those things can be done as the correction. But in the same time, you need to verify and you need to ensure that the same nonconformity will not happen again in future. Right? We need to make sure that the same nonconformity will not happen again in the future. So what we do is we do a root cause analysis and we identify the root cause for the particular nonconformity. And we take actions to eliminate that root cause, then definitely the same nonconformity will not happen in future. Why? Because we have eliminated the root cause behind the nonconformity. Right? You can use 5i, you can use fishbone, you can use several tools to identify the root cause for the nonconformity. Right. And corrective actions shall be appropriate to the significance of the effects of the nonconformities encountered, including their environmental impacts. Documented information shall be available as evidence of the nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent actions taken, the results of any corrective actions. Right. So then you need to maintain documented evidence, right, for nature of the nonconformities and subsequent actions taken, and also for the results of corrective actions. You need to you need to maintain documented evidence for those things. Right. I think now we have covered all the areas of this standard. Before winding up the session, I need to revisit to clause number 6.2 as well. Right. In clause number 6.2 is for environmental objectives. I think Rashita had explained you this, right? I need to add only a few things since uh, you learned environmental aspects after the Rashita session. So I need to add certain things. Look at this. The organization shall establish environmental objectives at relevant functions and levels, taking into account the organization's significant environmental aspects and related compliance obligations and considering its risk and opportunities. Right. When you set environmental objectives, right? When you set environmental objectives, you need to consider significant environmental aspects, right? You need to set objectives for your significant environmental aspects, right? Suppose electricity consumption is a significant environmental aspect, then you can set a target and you can set an objective for electricity consumption. If you take that same beer manufacturing plant as the example, you can set a target for electricity consumption. For an example, you can set 14.5 kilowatt hour per hectoliter. You can set those kind of targets considering significant environmental aspects. Why we need to set objectives for significant environmental aspects? We talked about significant environmental aspects in 6.1.5. We talked about action plans for significant environmental aspects. Even we take actions for significant environmental aspects in clause number 8.1 and also significant environmental aspects related to emergencies. We take actions in clause number 8.2. Then here again, clause number 6.2.1, in the objectives as well, they asked us to set objectives for significant environmental aspects. Why? Why? Right. We take actions, right? We take actions to minimize the significance of those significant environmental aspects. But it is better if we can set targets, specific targets. Then we can align our action plans to achieve those specific targets. And we can monitor the achievements of those targets. So we can get a better control of those significant environmental aspects by setting objectives for those significant environmental aspects. Right? So when you set objectives for your company, then you need to definitely consider significant environmental aspects. Right. I think the time is 10 past 4. So it's time for you to ask questions. And right, if you have any questions, you can ask. If you are not willing to ask questions, then at least you can ask questions in the chat or in the WhatsApp group. Right. Uh, it seems like you don't have any questions. So, if you do not have any questions, we can wind up the session. So, if you have questions, you can ask anything through WhatsApp. So, we'll be able to provide answers. And thank you very much for participating this session. And I think you might get a better understanding about ISO 14001 2026 standard requirements. And I think we were able to provide a comparison between 2015 and 2026 standards. So, again, if you have any questions, please let us know in the WhatsApp group. We'll be able to provide answers. And thank you very much for participating in this session. And Bashini, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hashan, for your valuable contribution. And again, thank you, everyone. A big thank should give to today's three of the trainers, Mr. Rasita Niroshana, Mr. Ranor Kalhan, and Mr. Hashan Randuno, who conducted today's ISO 14000 session. And also, thank to all the participants for the joining and engaging so actively and for making the most of the knowledge sharing today. I would also thank to the Rockwell Academy for supporting and organizing this session with us, and we'll meet soon with another session soon. Thank you.
Thank you.